Okay, then we can wait 5 minutes and start the transmission. Okay, then we can wait 5 minutes and start the transmission. Maybe Delphi, I think you could start to sharing screen.
Okay,
Yeah.
maybe we can start now. Hello everyone there. My name is Delfina Meireiras, and over there is Maximiliano Scianci. Thank you so much for joining us today in the presentation of Antagonismos Architecture magazine, and special greetings also to all the people following us through the YouTube channel. As Santi said before, today's goal is to be able to have a relaxed conversation with you, with the authors, and ask you and them some questions from the audience. So everyone who's in YouTube can write your questions down in the YouTube chat. First of all, I think we shall begin by introducing the Institute and the magazine. The Institute of Architecture of Buenos Aires is a space for research, critical reflection, and education of global architecture. The axes of the Institute are theory, history, technique, and representation. These are areas that are linked by a common factor that we understand is the vital center of our discipline, the project. The Institute proposes a series of activities that are organized in courses, seminars, conferences, roundtables, workshops, and also some open activities. Each of them is interested in building a speculative and optimistic vision of the discipline of architecture, and in order to broaden the record of a disciplinary scope of contemporary times. And on the other hand, Antagonismos magazine is a free and online publication of the Institute of Architecture, which focuses on the speculative problem of the project in an unprejudiced way and in constant critical construction. Architects, thinkers, and designers from all over the world regarding the current state of the discipline of architecture. So maybe we can begin with the issue number 11, that is Clásico Contemporáneo. Now I will share my screen. let me know when you can see my screen.
Okay, perfect. Maybe that you could hide the low bar.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, let's start. So in the beginning was Claudia, so in the editorial, and she makes the tour of all the text of the magazine and works. Okay, that's it. The editorial by Claudia Shmidt, who's here with us. And she makes a tour of all the text of the magazine, and towards the end, she assures that classical and contemporary are here, necessary antagonism. So in that sense, Claudia, I want to ask you, maybe what do you think that classical and contemporary are necessary antagonisms? In what sense do you mean that? You are mute, I think.
No.
Okay.
Sorry. It's a question now, or you are continuing and then?
Yes. Maybe to start talking about the issue number 11.
Okay, so I prefer to read a little bit because my English is not so good. But according to your question, no, I think that the 11th issue of Antagonismos focus on the apparently opposite pair, classic contemporary, but the impact of the articles turn around the strangeness, a sort of distance that is dislocated in time and space when the ambiguous analog and digital forms acquire certain vitality. No, as it's said in the editorial text, rambling, Potemkin architecture, Baroque typologies, or distorting arbitrations based on the invention invention of a sort of Serlian code, cause conflicted reactions between disbelief and anxiety, typical of formal speculation. But I found there that the line, that a sort of imagination between one point and another, according to the Euclidean definition, in this case, it was the dominant resource in the articles that transformed that strangeness into a disturbing phenomenon in a context in which matter is in suspense. It's in that sense when classical and contemporary become antagonistic. But instead, number 12 proposes a different idea, a sort of benevolent adjectivation of matter, this idea of extravaganza. Textures, colors, disposed in twists and intense shapes, suggest a sort of a priori analogy with this idea of extravaganza. But Antagonismos in the 12th issue is between the digital renders and the photographs, in my opinion. The difference is a matter of time. The renders as a project tool used before the building construction, or the photograph in tension with the renders made after the photographs of the materialized building. So I found a sort of antagonism between also the two issues.
Okay, yes, that's interesting, an interesting view and perspective, linking between the two issues. Okay, thanks, Claudia. We're talking on later again.
Maybe we can continue if this issue. The first article, it's Round Things, Cosas Redondeadas, from Mark Erickson. Hello, Mark. Well, Mark Erickson presents in Round Things images generated from a circle as a generative geometric figure. Here are some images from the article in the magazine. And Mark, we had a question, which was exactly why round things?
Yeah, so the title comes, I stole the title from a quote from Poincaré, which is, he's talking about, it's at the very beginning, he's talking about a circle. And he describes that, he says, so what happens when we have a circle and we make it out of some material? What do we have? We have, maybe we can prove, that the relationships will come up with the value pi, but really what we have is a round thing. And I think the thing that's interesting about that quote for me is the idea that, the circle, the kind of one of the most simple geometric figures, cannot be fabricated. And so that's interesting, both in terms of fabrication, in terms of material. You think about a piece of wood or whatever, even with a robot or a CNC machine, or if we think about it in most software where circles are NURBS curves, right? And they're approximations by tweaking the values of the weights at the four corners. And so there's this kind of idea of approximation built into this quote. And I think in this work, in this project, I've been really looking at how the approximation of a circle as a round thing can be a kind of generative drawing device.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Mark, and you could maybe describe the process of building images, because are stills from animations, right?
Yeah, so these are, so I work with processing, which is I think a pretty familiar software for people. It's open source creative coding platform. And so I have basically an algorithm that draws the relationship between, in this case, 8 interrelated spheres rotating around each other. And each of the spheres is being approximated as a round thing. So a sphere might have, let's say, the basis of the sphere might be a polyhedron of some kind inscribed within that sphere. And as those things rotate about each other, they're producing these objects that are all generated by the approximation of these spheres. It's not the easiest thing to describe, but the simplest way to describe it is if you can imagine a set of 8 interrelated compasses that are drawing circles, and then the compasses are moving. They're also changing diameter and skipping points. So that's the basis of it. So that's what's happening here. And then everything's done 2-dimensionally. So the equation that's used is the parametric equation of a sphere, but the z coordinate is just not used in the imaging. So that's what's happening.
And they are fantastic. I think that maybe it's important to think what the place of the geometry, the relevance in the architecture today.
Yeah, so I think the way I think about this, I mean, many of us here are educators, right? So we're all, or most of us, right. I think everybody, right? And so I think about this a lot and how I relate to students, and how I work with students. And so I think thinking about geometry from another quote from Poincaré that I really think is great is he has this quote where he's talking about how he just finished describing non-Euclidean geometry, so geometry of a higher order of dimensions than 3, and he uses Euclidean geometry to describe it. And so, but at the end of that passage, what he says is, notice that I've just described these extraordinary, unimaginable worlds with the language of ordinary geometry. So this idea of beginning with a very ordinary geometry, like a circle, in my work, and then also being able to relate that to students, I think for me is helpful. I start most of my classes with a circle, the first drawing exercise, a coding exercise with a circle.
Okay, yeah, I agree with that. Okay, thanks, Mark.
And Mark, I'm sorry, we have a last question for you. In your text, and everyone, when you read Mark's article, you'll find out this. You talk a lot about the auxiliary lines as part of what composes the final object. And we wanted to know what is the importance of the auxiliary lines as an integral part of the project, because what we see, the final drawings, we see, like in this image, the auxiliary lines and the final ones that compose the final project. We understand that it's the more darker lines.
Yeah. So, so the drawing, so the round object, this round thing, there's one of them, and it's drawn 18 different ways in each drawing, and each of them, some of them are unraveled around the surface of a sphere. So if you look at the image that you have here in the upper left-hand corner, there's a kind of jagged line, and that's the kind of unrolled entire round thing, this jagged blue line. And so I think part of it for me is, again, to kind of go back to kind of historical references, I think when we think about a lot of the work I've done, research I've done has been into Guarino-Guarini and 17th century geometry. Some of this is covered in the text. And I think one of the things that's interesting about that moment in the history of architectural geometry is the relative amount of rule breaking, I would say, and compared to, or they weren't rule breaking because there weren't any rules in that sense, right? It's before the codification of descriptive geometry, so things are a lot more loose, and so or looser, excuse me. So the when you look at the work of, say, someone like Guarino-Guarini, you can see the blending of what we might think of orthographic projection with Euclidean precepts, and so in the drawings, I take things that are, let's say, set out as kind of particular kinds of orthographic or architectural drawings, and then do them in slightly different ways by, say, changing the equation that I use to do that to produce other kinds of views. So the auxiliary lines are actually just other, not really, I guess, views of the object, but they're not views that would necessarily see. They're the geometric of the information of the object unrolled across the surface of the screen.
Okay, thank you for your answer.
Thank you.
So, Gabriel Esquivel ensures in the CLU code that the greatest achievement of Sebastián Osterlio treatise was to introduce the visual culture of architecture through drawings and diagrams. This research is part of a larger design project investigating Osterlio's illustrated treatise in parallel with discussion of aesthetics and advancing in artificial intelligence. So, Gabriel, I think you started with the 16th century treatise, then brought it into the digital, and finally those updates were materialized in physical models. I found that fantastic. So could you briefly explain how the whole journey was?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I mean, I've always been interested also in theory and in history. So the idea was really to go to the initial stages of architecture as we know it today, and go to a basic, one of the basic treatises, or sort of that Serlio did. So it was an emphasis that we wanted to do first on the idea of drawing itself, right? So what the importance of drawing, and how drawing is really sort of been dealt with throughout throughout history in architecture. But at the same time, the certain negotiations that Serlio has in terms of being speculative, very much so. Eisenman calls him the big transgressor, because he kind of violates all the rules. But at the same time, it gives you the ability to create new rules. And if you look at all the pages, and most of the pages that we were interested in exploring that had to do with the porticos, or the pages that had to do with sort of general drawings that had all kinds of fragmentation, so they were all, multi-scale fragmented ideas, that you are the one that has to kind of put them together. So it's like they're not really, he's not telling you how they go together. You have to imagine that. So that was really the premise between, that idea and AI in a way that we can train a series of images and use machine learning to put them together in a certain way and derive that condition, right? So it was sort of similar to take the idea of the fragments, the idea of the drawing, and sort of rethink about it in the code. And we, in this particular essay and all of other essays, we say that the code is really in the breaking of it. So there's really not a code that you follow, but are the multiple codes that you can break by following and really looking for different sort of combinations. So once you exercise that, you're engaging the code. So that's why we sort of assume, or we sort of say, that Celio was perhaps the first coder, because he was asking you to do these combinations. The other thing that was interesting is really that at the beginning, I mean, from the time that we did this project, it's incredible how much has changed today, and diffusion models are kind of sort of came after that and really kind of changed everything now. But at the time, we were training directly from neural networks and using sort of image. So it was GANs, that we were using normally. But then in the middle of that, other things began to appear, and we thought about something that's called a SynGAN. The SynGAN, and really what it does is really a way to break the pieces, because in a way, a lot of the pieces were sort of that we were producing were very much, they had a kind of a relationship of piece to piece or part to part that was not very clear. So through the SynGAN, we were able to even break it down even further and kind of create more of a combination of the fragments or the combination of the parts. So to me, that's really when the really breakthrough of this point of this project was when we were able to sort of address the issues of Celio through artificial intelligence and machine learning and training these ideas and really sort of following that. So it goes back to some of the ideas that you were sort of talking about earlier about whether classicism and modernism are really sort of connected. And this idea to me was really the idea that architecture is perennial and really doesn't have, to me, the affiliation of one way or another. It's just architecture itself. And if you use the medium of architecture throughout, then, that's really what I think this project was interesting in that at the time it was done. Maybe today, it really is not as interesting, is not as relevant as it was 2 years ago. But in a way, it was really a way to say, yes, we can still use Celio, or you can still use, whatever we want, Guarini, or etc., because they have something. We have something to learn with. That's the reason that we did this project. Sorry if I took too long.
Exactly. I think I agree with you, and I think that's because it's relevant because of that. It's still relevant. I think it's kind of research and investigation to look back in history and bring it back today and think contemporary architecture, thinking of that thinkers of maybe 16th century or maybe like that. Okay, thanks, Gabriel.
Thank you.
Gabriel, we have another question for you.
Sure.
In your article, you talk a lot about modulating diagrams and codes, as you have that before. And we would like, what do you think, or exactly, would you think your research as a modulating diagram or more as a code, if you could choose one of them?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm sure the idea of the modulation is really in a way that was a substitute in a certain way that it came from some of the research or the theoretical research that we did, and some language that was borrowed from sort of classic sort of architectural language or whatever. So the modulation in so many ways was sort of the idea that they're modules in a way that you combine in a way. So it's really an argument of parts, that you combine in a way. So that was really the relationship of the modulation. But I think to me, the diagrams are about sort of the idea of parts. So it's really diagrams of parts that, it's up to you to put them together. Because the way that we even photograph, when we fabricated this, the way it's photographed it's been photographed in different formats, in different ways that you can put the pieces together. So there's really not an ideal way to connect this. It's just the kind of openness of doing that. So the modulation is really the idea that, it's really a series of parts that can be combined in a specific way via the code. And the code itself, like I said before, it was to me the intervention itself of the capacity of taking something and reassemble it, through different, in this case, through artificial intelligence and machine learning, but it can be any other way. And the code really is in the core, let's put it this way, of the premise, or in the core of the theory behind what Sergio was doing in our interpretation, right? So I think there is something today, and Neil Leach talks about that. The idea that there is some affinity for us today, not in terms of classicism itself or the aesthetics of it, but I think the impetus of the idea or the connection that we have from the Renaissance is the rediscovery of everything we are interested in. And there's a multiplicity of directions. And this really kind of is part of that contemporary way of thinking, that we have a new interest, maybe generated by artificial intelligence, that we can rediscover certain things about architecture in a disciplinary sense in this particular case.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for your answer. Okay, we are going to continue with the magazine. And the following article is from Elisa Iturbe, who could not be here today, but his article is called Notes on Contemporary Readings of the Classical, Notas sobre lecturas contemporáneas del Clásico. Elisa Iturbe observes in Notes on Contemporary Readings of the Classical that the conditions of the 21st century have renewed an antagonism towards history. However, the theory of lateness, the book written with Peter Eisenman, suggests that a study of the classical can reveal a biases of the present, as well as the biases of the past, proposing a productive dialogue between the past and the present. Elisa teaches classical buildings to cultivate the practice of reading architecture, where the building itself is the object of study only to the extent that it allows the development of a practice of interpretation. The interpretation, in turn, which consists of a critical comparison, historical analysis, and theoretical conjecture, is a necessary device to question received knowledge. Finally, the images that illustrate the text are examples for formal analysis. They are based on a belief that understanding the dynamics of architectural form allows us to see the world around us and therefore builds a critical look at the present. Here are some images from her article. And the next article is Contemporary Architecture from Melisa Brieva.
Melisa, I think she's not here, and maybe we can talk about the article. Melisa Brieva develops in contemporary architecture an investigation focused on two aspects. On the one hand, representation systems based on digital methodologies, and on the other, their use for the production of speculative projects. In particular, I found two ideas very interesting. One that said that an architecture in the world is not just about a materialized building. There are innumerable cases of projects that are part of the world in a much more forceful and radical way than mere construction. And the other idea is one that says that architecture creates worlds. It creates both positive and negative contexts. The cases selected for this projective model in these investigations are paradigmatic buildings that, due to circumstantial situations, were not built and whose pregnant and disciplinary importance serve as an engine for simulation that detects the relevance embedded in the architectural scale for creation of new urban models. There's a set of image and variations or projects that historically weren't built, and that's it.
Okay, thank you. The next article is from Andrew Sanders, Baroque Topologies or Topologías Barrocas. Andrew Sanders explores in Baroque techniques new survived techniques to see, read, and represent architecture in novel and original ways. Hello, Andrew. How are you?
Hello, friends.
How are you?
Hello, Andrew.
Good.
We'll show some pictures from the article. And Andrew, can you briefly detail the survey techniques used?
Sorry, could you repeat that? There was a noisy
Yes,
part.
sure. If you could describe the survey techniques you use.
Various techniques for surveying and representation of the. Okay, sure, yeah. Yeah, this is a long, a long project that I've been working on for quite some time. Probably started originally when I taught for RPI back in 2007 when I was a coordinator for their Rome program and got to know a lot of these buildings in Rome. And since joining University of Penn in 2014, I was awarded a grant for this research sponsored by Autodesk and Faro, which is the major laser scanning company. And I wrote a grant to go and laser scan Baroque churches. They told me they'd allow me to have it for a month to scan one Baroque church. And I took it over. The interesting thing about the technique, I mean, it's a little bit, you know, as I was doing that in 2015, I was imagining people would be doing it on their cameras pretty soon, but it wasn't at that point. And we're almost to that point. But at that point, using a laser scanner, it was very difficult to do it in the space. I had to match all those targets, but computation, you know, was to a certain level right at that point where you can do that automatically now. There's enough brute force computation where it can go through a series of scans and find patterns that are the same, so it can automatically register. So it allowed me, you know, at that moment where I could go to Rome as one person and set up a scanner and do this and then automatically register. So at that point, it was a pretty big breakthrough to do that as one person. And, you know, there's multiple layers to the project where I had set up a lot of the relationships with people in Rome, you know, from priests to faculty at Sapienza to people at the American Academy. And, you know, it was quite a bit of work to get permission to scan these churches. That's probably the biggest, biggest technique. But then once I was able to scan them, you know, there's usually about 15 minutes per scan. And because the churches are typically symmetrical and have tile patterns, it's pretty easy to then go around and find different points depending on how long I had to work with each of the churches. And so there was, you know, typically each church has maybe 15 scans in them, and each one of those scans has millions of points. So by the time you compile them all, you know, some of them are up to 60, 80 million points per church. So technique-wise, I came back to University of Pennsylvania and had all of these, and it's a really interesting collection. It's essentially the same collection as the Bitcover Baroque series, this 3-volume set. It concentrates on 6 architects: Borromini, Bernini, Cortona, Rinaldi in Rome, and then in the Piedmont area are Torino, Guarini, Eric's favorite, Mark Erickson's favorite, and Vittoni. So it's essentially only those 6 architects, and we've been working with that. So I published a book, Baroque Topologies, which then focused on using that data not only for an empirical measuring device or what it's used for in the field a lot of time is for verification, but really to kind of understand it as a mode of representation, because I think architects, are, whether they like it or not, are going to have to start to understand that as a vehicle of representation. And so these studies that you're looking at are a lot of different kind of ways that we started to take some of these most familiar churches in the world and try to show them in kind of new and familiar ways. So, the series that you're looking at right now that's on the screen, this is, we call this one spheroidic cosmologies, because all of the Baroque churches, they want to challenge the centrally planned church of the Renaissance. So they're always kind of pushing and pulling those centers. So they're all quasi spheres. And these, are actually looking at the interiors from the exterior. So what you're seeing is the figured void of those. Certainly, there are a number of influences on that from architects or historians like Soisy, who was interested in the worm's eye and vaulting, to someone like Moretti, who did the inverse plaster cast in his Italian magazine Spazio in, I think, I have to go back and look exactly that time, but there's a number of that. But these are different than those for a number of reasons. Obviously, Moretti's casts were brilliant, but they're very streamlined without any kind of articulation. They're kind of modernized, and these have all of the detail, all of the colors, and these kind of things to go with it. So if you look at what we're looking at here, there's the 2 twin churches, initially started by Rinaldi, and then one was taken over by Bernini. There's Campantelli by Rinaldi on the left, Dolori by Borromini. The 2 on the bottom right are in Piedmont by Vittoni. And then the top one is a Rinaldi renovation, and the other right one is a Guarini church. But we use a number of different techniques to do that. I mean, a lot of it is really massive data, so we really relied a lot on cloud computing in order to process these in terms of meshes. We actually had been sponsored by Autodesk in the beginning, and they were just setting up the ability to use cloud computing to make meshes from LiDAR scans. And these are huge meshes. Each one of them are like 50 gigabytes. And they were using them because there were industries like oil platforms that need their entire facility scanned. And if they want to go in and put new infrastructure, new pipes in, they need meshes so they can have, they can detect collision. And so that's solely what they had set up the cloud computing for. But we started to send Baroque churches through them, and it worked quite well for that at that point. So there's a number of different drawings in this issue. One of the things I've done is teach a seminar every year here at UPenn, and so we work with that collection. So it was great to publish as a book, but we also continue each year to kind of look at different ways that we can use this and use them for representation and show these churches in ways that they haven't been seen before. This particular series, each of the students had one of the churches. We decided as a group to do this series, which we had called Oblique, the kaleidoscopic oblique. So it takes each one of the churches and in each view projects them in oblique reviews. So we try to see as much as you can see from the inside and the outside of the inside in multiple views of each church. And if you go through, there's should be a few others in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, this one was one of the most recent ones that we did last year. And this one we called polychromatic linings, which we borrowed that term linings from Venturi, Complexity and Contradiction, in his Inside Outside chapter. He speaks of the idea of a detached lining, which all of these Baroque churches have. And the students really wanted to, again, show these in oblique measured drawings, so they're all projected measurable drawings, but start to unravel or unfold those linings in different ways along different axes. And the colors that you see actually maybe at first appear to be the colors of the actual church, but they are not. They're actually a gradient ramping map for curvature of the meshes. So they transition. So it becomes an analytical reading of the figuration of the churches as these kind of unfold on the axis. So it's been a lot of fun. And so this year, I don't have any to show yet, but we're kind of working on kind of going back to the point cloud and really seeing what we can do with point clouds. And that there's a whole different challenge as well. And maybe a little explanation of these latter ones. So the seminar, we do the whole collection of all 6 architects for the first part of the seminar, and then we decide a new technique for representing all of those buildings uniformly. And then the second half of the seminar, student can take on any of the 6 architects or any of the buildings and dwell down further into those specific tropes. For instance, this is Borromini, starting to look at all of the different inflections that happened in Borromini. They went through the scans. This one was looking at Cortona and how he uses layers the same way as a painter. He was trained as a painter. And so we start to build these models that are based more specifically on the tropes of those individual architects, because I think for many, showing all of that collection is a little bit hard to decipher what the difference between one architect and the other really is. And that's what we really kind of dwell down on, how to really have a close reading of those architects, because they all were trained, and none of them were trained necessarily as architects, except for maybe Rinaldi. You know, they all had different training. None of them had a master's of architecture. So those kind of different influences play their way out into very different tropes within each one of the kind of buildings, and the way they start to work within that sort of Baroque paradigm. This one, for instance, that one was Rinaldi. This is Rinaldi anyway. This is Campitelli taken apart into all of its elements. Rinaldi was kind of putting together things in odd ways in these kind of difficult holes that kind of resisted perfection or challenged the idea of perfection. They were a bit of Frankensteins, and they were usually held together with a really heavy cornice, these kind of different proportions. So some of these drawings and the one before are kind of taking apart all of Rinaldi's language and looking at them in different ways, different reassemblages. This one's more Rinaldi. Yeah, that was Rinaldi. Yeah.
Yes.
Then Guarini,
and Guarini, everything Guarini does is in circles, right, Mark? So everything is polar. So these are just ways of kind of unrolling and taking it apart based on all the centers and all the poles.
Yeah, there you have a common point.
Yeah, these Vittoni, which is, I don't know, Bernardo Vittoni was not hugely well known in the U.S., but really amazing. He actually helped complete Guarini's book. After his death, he was a sort of pupil of Guarini's post death. He's amazing Piedmont architect. He's sort of the last architect in the Bitcover series. The last of this lineage of the centrally planned Italian architects. And at that point, the vaulting is becoming so thin. So a lot of the kind of effects that were happening, these kind of subjective effects, these trompe-l'oeils and such that happened in painting, and then happened in relief, and then happened structurally with Guarini. Now these domes have completely delaminated into multiple shells, and they're all, entirely load-bearing compressive vaults. So super, super thin masonry. It's just absolutely amazing. So these are kind of analysis of looking at all those inside vaults, and there's a few more of those kind of Vittoni churches, as well as his colors are absolutely amazing. They become so thin that he does really, outrageous things like piercing pendentives and things like that. So these are just students taking a lot of those thin inner kind of delaminated shells and recombining those.
Here's again Bernini, Borromini, Vittoni, and Rinaldi.
Yeah.
Drawings are amazing, Andrew.
Excuse me?
I mean, the drawings, these images are amazing.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, and we'll be in touch to see this year's work.
Okay, that's good. I hope my seminar class, I know one person in my seminar is listening, so up the ante.
Okay. Sure.
Thanks.
And with Andrew, we are finishing the this number, the temporary contemporary classic. Now we're going to go to number 12, which is our latest number. You can tell me when you can see my screen.
Great. Well, hi, Isaac. Good evening. In the editorial, Isaac Mission asks us about how the material could act with a certain autonomy and describes two approaches that have historically taken place on the material notion, top-down and bottom-up. For the first, material is applied to the finished project as if the concept is inherent to the material, whereas the second, it has its own intelligence to guide the design process into how form and structure should be. So I wonder, Isaac, regarding the two approaches that you mentioned, with which I agree, can you associate them with some era, some style, some movement?
I mean, the text and the introduction basically points on this, on what you said, based on my view of how I was educated and practiced. It's like these two poles that usually don't meet, no? And the material can become either this like isolated part of the conceptual process, or this truth, no, that you have this rigor and have to follow it, and if you don't follow it, then you're like cheating on that rigor. And kind of the idea or the vision or proposal that this text is creating is kind of trying to get less attachment of that rigor and make it a bit more intuitive, the way we treat material, in a way, the way we see material, that it can be performative or ornamental, and kind of bring it back to the discourse. I think it can be very helpful to conceptualize a project with material in play. And I think the examples on the issue go very much with that, no, not just see the clear project without any resolution, but how can this resolution really bring back some ideas of a project, and also with the use of digital technologies, there's like some interest on bring the idealization of the material back into the computer, and then maybe the computer can start glitching these ideas of the material and then bring it back to the real life. So I mean real life, but then again the perception of how you perceive the real material and what material should do, and the honesty of material is questioned, and I think can bring a surprising outcome, maybe not always useful, but a different outcome. And then lastly, the image of this painting of Richter, I pointed out because it questioned the notion of abstraction and how material can be also like I don't know, formal, and has its own structural or organizational qualities that can be used in architecture.
Okay, yeah, it's interesting to think the material in some terms, I think.
Sorry, I couldn't get this.
I think that it's interesting to think the materials in some terms.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's what I think it's like kind of nice about it is that it's not so much documented, or I mean it is, but not in this way that it's not, let's say, completely structural, completely ornamental. It's a bit open, and I think it gives that possibility of moving wherever the material is asking, or wherever you want to edit the material.
Yeah, okay, right. Thanks,
Thank you so much, Isaac.
Thank you.
So, following his editorial, we have tension material tension, or tensión material, from Nate Hume. Nate states the material tension that today the division between virtual and natural materiality has become much more nuanced and confusing. Thus, the assemblies between the new materials affect the conception of space as we know it. The trim poles set up by competing digital and artisanal aesthetics provides a point of tension to work through the pursuit of different conditions of material strangeness. Materials such as smart mud, mycelium bricks, hand-treated, cross-laminated timber, and bioblocks contain the potential to collapse the difference between the natural and artificial, bringing into question the traditionally understood divide between them. The paradoxical combinations serve to open up new opportunities within architecture by using materials to produce different understandings of texture, tectonics, composition, and spatial perception. Running through all the work exists an investigation of using materials and their texture to create saturated atmospheres the chromatic treatment or exaggerated qualities of materials allow them to become extra natural. And hello, Nate, how are you?
Good.
Sorry if I talked a lot, but now I have a question for you to talk and to answer. Okay, so in your article, you mentioned the fuzzy qualities between the natural and artificial. And we would like you to detail what those qualities are exactly.
Sure. I mean, I think it's on one hand, maybe a more pragmatic thing is just the tension of what is actually sourced naturally or what is, synthetically produced. I think that it's also a kind of cultural question of what we, even beyond architects as a kind of general public, what we think is natural or not. And I think that in a lot of these projects, it's certainly kind of pushing it to an extreme to kind of really draw that out. But we talk a lot, within the studio where some of this work was developed, even just looking more locally at things like coffee shops of the last decade that are full of this kind of like rustic wood, that none of it's really coming from some deep forest. All of it is, in some ways kind of produced to look like that through, machines, through almost like a lab-like procedure, and even the way it's kind of finished, and the things that we might think like CLT that actually look colder and more engineered are in fact coming originally from, something grown. So, I think unlike, in past centuries where it was very clear within the discourse what's natural or what is not, or how do we treat these materials, or when do you use one versus the other. I think now that, again, on the kind of engineering level, but then also on the level of sort of cultural association, that all of that is in much more of a kind of gray area now. And so, my interest is sort of drawing that out, less thinking about the distinctions, but more existing kind of in that middle where it's kind of unclear one or the other, but that both are able to kind of give us these new aesthetic registers and new qualities across the materials, rather than trying to make kind of fake versions of the old natural or purely looking for something that's this kind of synthetic, future condition. So something that's really kind of drifting between all those registers is where I kind of see, one kind of cultural register or kind of question of the moment.
Mm-hmm.
In that sense, Nate, I found very provocative and attractive at the same time the idea of the extra natural or extra artificial in a way. And maybe you could explain this a little bit.
Sure. I mean, I think that with some of these things, I think there's also this tension between, as we are using a whole host of different, not just materials, but also procedures to kind of work those materials versus just kind of harvesting something and cladding it, but all the kind of ways we can finish, cast, kind of extend materials qualities. I think that it allows us to start to play with these tensions of like something like the grain or the texture not matching the underlying material, or the chromatic qualities not matching the kind of textural assumption. And I think that with those, they can kind of tease things out to feel, even more rough or more saturated or kind of more of the condition you would expect. So like the image that's up right now, taking these kind of, kind of basic wood shingles, but allowing them through kind of roughing up the texture beyond what's already there within the wood, becomes more pronounced. And then beyond that, the assembly starting to kind of peel in these kind of large sections. So everything goes kind of a step beyond what you would expect the material or its texture or its kind of thickness to give you, as a way just to kind of make this kind of heightened atmosphere or kind of awareness of those qualities.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Nate.
Thank you so much, Nate, for sharing with us.
Thank you.
Next one, we have Francisco Cadao, who couldn't join us today with his building Damero. Maxi, if you want to talk about it.
Okay, thanks. You see, Francisco Cadao presents us one of his latest works, the Damero building, which is organized and as a slightly porous volume based on the alternate arrangement of patios and terraces, the facets index programmatic and contextual difference on the different phases of the prism. A continuous envelope of bricks allows to control through its texture and variable permeability the sunlight and the visuals of the different types of spaces, as we are seeing on these photos and drawings too. It is almost a building of material. That's a great building.
Thank you, Maxi. And last one, but not least, we have Andreas Körner with vascular stereotomy, or stereotomía vascular. Andreas Körner suggests in vascular stereotomy that in the Anthropocene era, the greenest way to build is perhaps not to build at all. At the same time, he highlights the importance of materials such as soil, earth, and stone, and presents his research on cavern strata. Hello, Andreas. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. Hi.
Hi. Well, of course, we have some questions for you. We would like to know how could you develop the provocative idea of building without building at all? Where did the idea came from?
Well, I think that was a bit of a side note in the text, I have to say, but no, I think that was a bit like a take on. I mean, the title was material extravagance, and nonetheless, when often we speak about materials now, also how Nature's talked about the sourcing of materials, we talk about sustainability in many aspects, but we're still proposing new buildings to being built. So the text, maybe I can answer it in a way like how the text came together. When I was approached, I was actually planning a design studio, like the brief for a design studio in Innsbruck, which was then called, I think, Vascular Strata. Was working with these two analogies, like a biological and geological, where these two things kind of start working together in this Anthropocene, as you summarized. And I think it was approaching the topic of materials in architecture less as something like a surface effect where it's often treated, but more something that has like a substance and almost it's seen like a substrate for whatever happens with the building after construction. So weathering plays a big role and so on. And the text is then arranged along the line of these juxtaposed images, where there's usually some artificial and the natural phenomena, but also this long-term interest by, I think, researchers, artists, also architects in these sliced stones, which are often also, of course, in a lot of these Baroque churches that Andrew showed, these incrustations and so forth. So it was also playing a bit with this fascination of material extravagance, of complexity of surfaces that derives actually from something that's formed by nature, so to say, over long stretches of time. And in that sense, maybe also conceiving buildings over longer stretches of time. If that somehow I've evaded your question, I know, but I hope it's still satisfying.
It's okay, no problem.
So, Andres, I wonder, in your text, you make a difference between sustainability and ecology. And I want to ask you, how would this transition, do you think it would take place from one another? And what are the potentials for a new ecological architecture?
Well, I think that it might be provocative, but I think that focusing on sustainability in a way can also be seen as sustaining a system that might be flawed. It is a way how you can, it's often also designed sustainability as resilience, or the ability of a system to withstand stress and so on and so forth. And I wonder if, so sustainability alone as a concept might not help us out of the current misery of the kind of destruction of our environment. Ecology is, in a way, accepts also a multitude of agents that are engaged with each other. So the ecology of multiple organisms, for example, in an ecosystem, that is much broader and allows actually also other agencies. So therefore, it's a kind of a rhetoric play between these two terms that are juxtaposed equally as the images. I mean, these images here on the right, they were done with Midjourney. I think the text was written in May or June last year when that was fresh. I think as Gabriel said in his comment, this technology moves on so rapidly. So now seeing this on the page, how that moved on, it's almost a bit like not so contemporary anymore as the title of the 11th issue. But
yeah, okay. I think in ecological way, it's a more complex way of thinking. The sustainability, as you put it, you talk about soil, about earth.
Sorry, I didn't understand the question.
No, it's just a comment.
Okay.
I mean, you talk about a lot about soil and earth and stone and materials that are with us from ancient times, but you put it in a new way of thinking about them.
Yeah, I mean, it's of course inspired by a lot of work on this by others, but that deal a lot with soil and also at the Bartlett where I teach in biointegrated design, we deal a lot with soil and the organisms that live in it and how you could actually integrate organic matter and biological processes into the building. But the way this came about was I was looking a lot into the text of Gottfried Semper, and in the title it's this vascular stereotomy, and it is a bit of a hint that a lot of digital architecture, which was a bit the stuff that I've been surrounding myself and been surrounded by over the last years, often spoke about tectonics as the way to shape and form buildings. And Semper actually does not only speak of tectonics, he also speaks also of stereotomy, which is a process that includes like digging and digging, masonry and so forth, so earth things. But also tessellation, for example. So something that even if you have thin tiles, that would be stereotomy, not tectonic in this way. So I was trying to look back into 19th century literature that's been digested many, many times, and I think it's actually relevant to probably all the stuff we've talked about this evening. But I found it interesting in this context of soil, actually, to dig that up. No pun intended.
I agree that Gottfried Semper is still relevant. Right?
Some of it. Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks, Andreas.
Thank you so much, Andreas. So with him, we are finishing this last number, Antagonismos 12, Antagonismos 12. And we would like to open up the conversation to all of you. If you have any comments on the magazine or in another article, any question you would like to make, if you have one, from this number or the previous one.
I have one question for everyone, maybe especially for Gabriel and Andreas and Nate, but open for everyone who wants to talk. We talk a lot about geometry and digital and material. And maybe the question is, what do you think is the importance of materializing digital models in physical models? That passage from one to another, if it is important or not.
I mean, maybe I could jump in. I think the work that I was showing from last year in here, like the image that's up on the front right now, that's thinking more in terms of kind of full-scale prototyping. So it's interesting what Isaac was saying, that the kind of two directions you could approach material, and I think I certainly work in like a messy middle. It's kind of resisting trying to think of it as just an applique that happens at the end, but also usually not so much following like the material logic from the start and letting that form the entire project. But I think that in the last few years, the models have become really important for me in two directions. I think, along that same comment. And the one direction is this, thinking about, full-scale prototype and just how some of these speculations can, start to kind of come out into the built environment. But I think on the other hand, it was almost a simpler move in the last decade to the models with my students. And some of that was just to resist some of the kind of tropes and baggage of the digital modeling and the kind of digital projects. So just by forcing them out into the model, other things happened. We had other realities in terms of material, even the photography of it, things like lighting, thinking about tectonics, you just had to deal with things in a different way if it was no longer purely digital or even purely 3D printed. So some of that was just to kind of almost create this irritant or this kind of like tension. How do we kind of break up the assumptions or how we're operating? And those scale models, like some of the photos that come later on, those are not really a one-to-one with material. They start to become abstracted versions of that material, whereas this can really act in the way the material might at full scale. So for me, that was the physical models became really important, and not just in testing it or representing it, but really as part of that kind of feedback loop that would add this kind of a little bit of, again, kind of messiness, and then you loop that back into modeling and these other procedures, and it just sort of destabilizes or disturbs the process enough to see what that kind of adds to it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, thanks, Nate.
I mean, if I might jump in, I don't know if we moderate this or. So, no, I just wanted to maybe add something. I totally agree with what Nate just said. I think there's this differentiation between whether you do materialization as a prototype or as a representational model are two different things, and I think they become hybridized a bit in a way, if that's a bit what you talked about. But I also think that recently, especially in the whole field of digital fabrication, it went a lot towards prototyping, which often led that the outcome was focused on fragments and pieces and sort of like things that were themselves representational for the architectural proposal that was then often kind of neglected, or it's a small 1 to 500 model next to it where none of these spatial qualities are actually kind of developed. And I think that is something which maybe would be interesting to see more, how not larger prototypes, but maybe also having both together, spatial considerations, full-scale models, and then fragments that are prototypes. But yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, thanks, Andrea.
Thanks, Nate and Andreas, for sharing with us your thoughts. Okay, if anyone has any other comment or question to add.
I have another one, maybe. Okay, this one is for everyone, especially I think for Mark and Andrew. I think in both cases, as they put it, their investigation, the research are not mere representation, but rather projects. And I wanna ask you if you agree with that.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part of the oh, sorry, you
Okay.
maybe answer, Mark, because I didn't hear the last part. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. I repeat it then. I mean that in both cases, in the research that you show in the magazine, they are no mere representation of a building or of animation in the case of Mark, but they are rather a project in itself. Do you agree with that, or it's just a system for representing something else?
I'll let, maybe Mark, do you want to answer that first?
Sure. I think, I think it's, so I'll go back to the passage that I started with the Poincaré, which I think for the work, right, this idea that the circle, or, he's basically talking about the idea that geometry is abstract and the representation of it or the rendering of it is always some kind of approximation. So in that sense, I think that the project that I'm working on is a kind of representation, right? It's an approximation of a kind of abstract geometry, and that's the kind of generative part of the work. But as far as a kind of, in the kind of architectural sense of the word, as a stand-in for an architectural project or an object that might be in the world besides an animation, definitely not. I mean, there's no idea that anything that I've shown has a kind of, let's say, other outcome coming from it. It's not, it is what it is. It's an animation. They're animations essentially, and that's what they are.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe. It's an interesting question. Yeah, certainly it's beyond representation, even though representation is at stake.
Okay.
I mean, there's a few ways to go about that. One, I think, one representation typically in architecture school somewhere starts with the invention of perspective as this kind of Renaissance thing. And one of my arguments, it should start way back with the rope and the cord with the surveying. Surveying is kind of the origin of representation. That's one. But I think also there's something else that's in the air maybe between Mark and my research, is there's a long lineage of this close reading formal analysis, right? That is in itself a project, right? And so depending on who you talk to, it has different origins. For me, it starts with Wolflin, right? So Wolflin could be considered the founder of formalism in the sense that he wanted to, have a history without names and not so connoisseurial, and it was really about understanding and being able to read, this work. So he takes an approach from psychological perception to evaluate the Renaissance and the Baroque as his first book to test that thesis, right? And that sort of close reading, that sort of analytical, really analysis, like psychoanalysis, close reading has been, a project in architecture even before then. But I think I would consider the work that we do somewhere within that kind of lineage. But I think, if you want to be within that lineage, and certainly having taught at Cooper Union and having Eisenman as an instructor and working for him, found myself somewhere within that early in my career. I think you have to innovate within that. So, in each stage, people make different innovations. I think Mark's work is in that vein as well. There seems to be a line of thought, a procedural line of thought of taking that close reading to a different level, given a different perspective. You could look at someone like Preston Scott Cohen, that takes ideas of projective geometry coming from Robin Evans, his mentor, and elevates that beyond two-dimensional composition and uses projective geometry to analyze, see these kind of things. You could look at Venturi, who is informed really by kind of literary tropes of the kind of new formalists that were looking for ambiguity in language and these kind of things as a trajectory to look at buildings. So I would say there's, as a project, that sort of close reading is a project and always has been. And I think there's many that share in that. So hopefully it's doing something, my work, and I think others, we can always add a little bit to contribute to that. And certainly representation is in there as part of that.
Yeah, exactly. I think the same, Andrew. Thanks.
I was going to say, I think you asked me before, and looking at the image that is on the cover, I was in Nate's in that particular review, and I think what was really important about that project was really not so much the idea that these, of course, it's important to do prototyping in full scale and real scale. But I think there's really, the beginning to understand really material, more ontologically, in a sense that material really has a life of its own and is really something quite unique in a way. So it's kind of like Jan Bennett talks about, like vibe and matter. So I think the discussion was really more about the idea of taking the materiality through the vehicles of drawing and models, but also really to rethink the importance of materials in a much more ontological position, and the idea of the vibrancy of the material, and of course really so that in and of itself it has its own life and in its own project in a way. So just like the close reading project or whatever, I think the material project is also a project of its own. So, and we've seen some examples here as well. So I think in a lot of these projects that have been presented, I think there's really many arguments that can be derived, not only the argument that's been really presented as part of the article, but also, derivations of that has to do with close readings of the project, this kind of indexical readings or so, but also the materials themselves in different iterations, are really important. And I think you were asking about, using drawings and using models and using digital expression and digital representation. So in many ways, that is also a project of representation. But I think in my personal way of looking at, fabrication, and the way I used it is really, to me, was a really catalyst for a lot of things, right? So it's really some kind of certainty or a proof or not that some of the speculations that we were sort of talking about earlier in the project get sort of discussed in that particular way in a kind of physical realm. I have to say also that, some of the projects that we worked on we're using material as a vehicle for representation and really demonstrate some of the formal aspects of the projects that we were looking at it digitally. And that was really the case. So in other words, the material itself that was made from was not really the argument. Later on, for example, it really became the argument that really the material used for the fabrication was actually absolutely critical, because of the material logic of the project in terms of, sort of talking on expanding the discussion of the project. So I think, it can go either way, that the material becomes a representation itself, in particular projects, or it becomes a critical aspect of the project itself. And I think, for example, the last project that Andrew did, which I'll ask him or whatever, that the stair project or whatever, I think there's so many critical aspects of that project in the kind of the fabrication process and the way that the project was derived. But also, I think the material in a way plays an important role beyond fabrication and beyond representation, I guess.
Yes, sure, no doubt. Okay, Gabriel, thank you. Well, Delphi, I don't know if Another question or comment?
I have a question. So you mentioned a little bit about Antagonismos as the name. So why is really the name Antagonismos, which means some kind of polarity sometimes, or it has many ways to be interpreted. So why is it sort of the name relevant in a way for you specifically in calling the magazine that way? I know I've known you for quite some time, but we've never really talked about that.
Well, that's a great question, Gabriel. And I think that maybe, as you put it, is many ways to think about this. I think that maybe it's a way or a word that express to think, to put in dialogue terms not necessarily always opposite, but sometimes yes. But I think it's important to think of terms and notions and concepts and think it in a way contemporary and put in opposition sometimes and sometimes not. But more or less is to think about them, and like classical contemporary is a good example, or material extravagance. Maybe the last two issues talk about that, and well, I don't know if I answer your question, but well, it's a good way for us to think about the antagonism.
Yeah, I really agree with Maxi. I think the spirit of the magazine is that to face things as antagonisms, but not enemies. Like explore and not only explore exactly, like to investigate and to learn about contemporary architecture that's happening around us, between students, between classes, in universities, in solid architectures, solid architects, and put them all together in a place and see how they interact between them, and create a space of discussion, but in a constructive way, and I think it's very interesting to have a space where you can find different types of thinking or different types of material or different architecture, trying to live all together in the same place and inspire you to think in different ways. I believe that it's a little bit the spirit of Antagonismos.
Thank you.
You're
And
welcome.
to you, Gabriel.
Thanks for the question to us.
Okay, well, thank you very much, all of you, for joining us, for your time. I'm very enriching for the exchange of ideas, this experience. We talk a lot about a lot of things. So thank you. And we keep in touch. And I don't know, let's see if you want to say something last.
Yeah, thank you all for being here and joining us, and also for the people on the YouTube chat for your comments. And well, the following number is upcoming, so I hope you all are waiting for it. Also, the number 13, and I think these experiences or these conferences or types of events are very rich for me to learn from all of you, and where we can meet all together and work together our ideas. I think that's good. So thank you all for listening to us and for your time.
The next issue is about drawings of architecture. So we'll keep in touch, and thank you again.
Yeah, and we have very antagonism architects in that number, so I think you will like it.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, thank
Thanks,
you.
guys. Great job.
Thank you.
Chao a todos, gracias.
Right.